The Curé of Ars. Chapter 15. The Last 20 Years. 1. The Attempts at Flight. The life of a priest which has been spent almost entirely in the confessional can hardly be expected to number many startling events. From 1830 on, the existence of the Curé de Ars was one of sublime and crucifying monotony. At intervals over the years, however, there are one or two facts that stand out. It seemed a settled thing now that he was never to leave his parish again. In the year 1835, he went once more to the diocesan seminary to take part with his colleagues in the exercise of the annual retreat. Monseigneur Devey made him go back to Ars before the exercises had even started. "They need you too much there," the Bishop of Belley told him. "And as for you, you stand in no need of a retreat." Indeed, the saint felt he needed one. His heart thirsted for those few hours of recollection and solitude. It was of no avail. The favor was refused him, without a word of protest, without a single phrase that would have betrayed his disappointment. The Abbé Vianney humbly obeyed his orders. He went back and once more shut himself up in his confessional. 5 years went by, and never a day or even an hour he could call his own. The Curé de Ars could not refrain sometimes from giving exasperation to feelings that haunted him, and that were becoming an obsession, a real martyrdom. His responsibilities as priest in charge of a parish, as confessor of such a host of souls, appalled him. "It isn't the work I'm afraid of," he lamented before some priests who were trying to raise his spirits. "It is the account I shall have to give of my life as a curé." A little while before his death, he was heard to say with a sigh, "You don't know what it is to go from a curé of souls to the judgment seat of God." He wanted to go away and hide himself in some obscure corner where he could weep for his poor life. "Oh, if I could do that," he added, "how I would love God." For that was all he wanted. He thought that though he was working, as he was, only for God, he did not love him enough because he had not the time to tell him of his love at every other moment. It is an astonishing picture. Here was a saint, the Curé de Ars, who had given himself up body and soul, like St. Paul, to give grace of God, who was wearing himself out in the labors of his amazing apostleship, and yet who felt that the only thing that could ensure his salvation was to leave Ars. It was, of course, as events were to prove, an illusion, perhaps even, let us not shirk the word, a temptation. In any case, it was a horribly distressing trial, but God permits such things in the lives of his saints. More than once the Abbé Vianney asked Monseigneur Devey's permission to retire into a monastery. Sometimes he suggested a Trappist monastery, sometimes a Carthusian. Monseigneur Devey refused. "God gives me almost everything I ask, except when I pray for myself," the curé admitted ingenuously to the headmistress of his providence. "That's only because you ask God to take you away from Ars, and God doesn't want it," Catherine replied. In any event, one fine day, or rather one fine night, in 1840, the Abbé Vianney made up his mind in earnest to retire. He put a letter in the post, asked the bishop for an exit, which he can hardly have hoped for, and then about 2 o'clock in the morning he set out on the Villefranche-sur-Saône road. It seems that he had it in mind to seek admission to the Trappist monastery nearby, where Benoit Joseph Labre, the holy mendicant whom his grandfather Pierre Vianney had put up 70 years before at Dardley Farm, and left the memory of his wonderful character. The saint set off at a brisk pace. Nobody gave the alarm, and there was no obstacle on the road. Quite suddenly, however, after he had gone about 3/4 of a mile, the fugitive stopped. At the point where he came to a halt stands the humble cross of Les Combes, which marks the boundary of the commune of Ars. Is what I am doing now really the work of God? He asked himself. Isn't the conversion of a single soul worth more than all the prayers I could say in solitude? Resigned and reassured, he retraced his steps in the direction of the church, which he entered a little later than his usual hour of arrival. None of the penitents who were waiting for their turn can have had the ghost of a suspicion of the poignant conflict which had just been tearing his little priest's heart. To all outward appearances so tranquil, who had already taken his place in the confessional, where he was beginning his 18-hour day. But the obsession woke to life again on the occasion of a serious illness. In May of 1843, the Abbé Vianney was carrying out his crushing sacerdotal task single-handed. He was worn out with overwork that might well have knocked him up long before. And one evening, when he was preaching the month of Mary, he collapsed in the pulpit. He was carried to his room. Doctors diagnosed bronchial pneumonia, and for 9 days he hovered between life and death. While a priest, who was one of his friends, was celebrating the first of 100 masses, which he had himself vowed to St. Philomena, quite suddenly he said he was cured. His convalescence, however, was a long one, and while he was regaining his strength, the idea that had harried him before returned. On May 27th, the Count d'Esgratz paid a call on him. He found him in his room, sitting on his exiguous bed, and the saint's eyes were filled with tears. "Why, what's the matter?" the Count asked. "Nobody has any idea of the quantity of tears I have shed on this little bed," the Abbé Vianney replied. "Ever since I was 11, I've wanted solitude, and it's always been refused me." The story began to spread to the chateau and then in the village of Ars that the curé wanted to leave his parish. It's no use hiding from ourselves the fact that the holy man believes he has come to the end of his labors. The Countess d'Esgratz wrote to her father, M. de Colombière. He had promised himself, "I'll go on till I drop," and now he has dropped. If he prayed for his life, it was for himself, in order that he might have time to prepare for death in silence and solitude. It is certain that after such a shock the Abbé Vianney was in need of rest. His doctor recommended a change of air. His bishop advised him to take at least the 15 days of holidays then authorized by the diocesan regulations, and more if it was necessary. The Curé de Ars did not contradict them, but the longing to leave the parish once and for all was stronger than ever. He made up his mind to go. On Monday, September 11th, he gave his neighbor a letter for Monseigneur Davy, and when midnight struck, he set off. This time, once again, he set out down the road alone with a bundle in his hand, and took the route that leads by a footbridge over the stream to the main Lyons road. Someone, however, had detected him slipping out into the dark, and a young man of ours overtook him, not to stop him, but to carry his baggage and to accompany him on the end of his journey. They recited the rosary after rosary on their way, and finally in the evening, after they had walked nearly 20 miles, they arrived at Dardley. The Abbé Vianney, who was deeply moved, went back at once to his old home. But he had reckoned without the pilgrims. Hot on his heels, they began to arrive by the score. His young traveling companion had given him away, and they demanded that the saint should resume his confessions in the Dardley church. Just at that moment, the curé of Savigny appeared with the bishop's reply. There was no question, it said, of the Abbé Vianney leaving the diocese of Belley. However, if it should be agreeable to him, Monseigneur Davy was willing to offer him charge of the pilgrimage of Our Lady of Beaumont, down among the mares of Dôme. He went there, celebrated Mass, and when he had finished giving thanks, he announced firmly to the curé of Savigny that he had made up his mind. "Let's go back to Ars," he said. The jubilation in the village when the bells pealed out for the return of its beloved priest was unimaginable. The crowd of pilgrims has melted away, the Countess de Garetz had written to her father 6 days before. The church is almost deserted. Here and there a few unhappy women are praying in front of the lighted candle. I can't tell you the sadness that fills one's heart at the spectacle of such an utter change. It is a real transformation from life to death. That dazzling afternoon of September 19th, 1843, on the contrary, saw a transformation from death to life. You can't begin to imagine how happy people were. Catherine reported. There wasn't a soul who didn't hurry down to have a sight of the man they had lost for 8 long days. The very thrashers flocked in from the barns in their working clothes. Never can a man or a parish priest have inspired such affection and loyalty. Maybe it was only at long intervals that these good folks of ours saw their curé to speak to, but nothing could quench their pride in him and their love for him. Leaning on his walking stick, the Abbé Vianney made the round of the square, going from one parish to another, blessing, weeping, hardly able to articulate the few affectionate words he pronounced. Everything was lost, was it then? He said. Well, it's all found again now. I'll never leave you any more, my children. I'll never leave you any more. There we had our saint returned to our affection then, Catherine observed. He had a few days of rest after it, for the crowd of pilgrims had dispersed during his absence, and he took up his ordinary duties among us. As soon as the news was known, penitents started arriving from every direction, and he resumed his life. It is already clear enough what these last words meant. He returned to his confessional. I'll never leave you any more, he had promised, but he had not bound himself forever. 10 years, almost to the day after his promise, he came near breaking it. The human heart, even if it beats in a breast full of the love of God, cannot escape its conflicts and its moments of weakness. The stern Monsignor Davy, who would have never listened to the curé, had died. His successor in the see of Belley, Monsignor Caledon, might well prove more accommodating. A dream, for it had started as no more than a beautiful dream, had been haunting the Abbé Vianney's mind. One of his former fellow pupils in the seminary, who had remained one of his greatest friends, was the Abbé Jean-Claude Collin, founder of the Society of Maris, and he had just added on to his house at La Nellère, in the Rhône department, a sort of modified Trappist monastery. Here the priests and lay brothers were to spend their days, and a part of their nights, too, in the adoration of the Blessed Sacrament, and as soon as the Curé d'Ars heard the news, his heart leapt. What would he not give to finish in the peace of adoring prayer an existence which had been harried for more than half its length by the interminable mutter of the sins of men? He begged the Abbé Collin for the privilege of being received. The founder could not but be delighted at such an acquisition, which would greatly strengthen the new-born institution. All the same, he asked the Abbé Vianney to think things over carefully and not to be in too much of a hurry. Finally, on the insistence of the saint, he agreed to receive him, and the entry of the Curé d'Ars into Our Lady of La Nellée was fixed for Monday, September 5th, 1853. There is no knowing how things might have turned out if the saint, in his open-heartedness, had not revealed his intentions to Catherine, who betrayed his confidence. A happy betrayal, if there ever was one. The Abbé Vianney's plans was to go to Lyons, where he had a brother-in-law, and whence he would go on to La Nellère by carriage. It never occurred to him that it would be simpler to take a carriage at Ars itself and to drive directly to the place where he planned to take up his abode. God willed, however, that the holy man, who was so clear-sighted when it was his neighbor's good that was concerned, should bungle the organization of his own departure, which was to have been for good and all. It was about midnight on September 5th when he said goodbye to his presbytery. Only 2 people accompanied him. Catherine, who carried a lantern, was to light him as far as the footbridge over the stream, and Marie Fillet, Catherine's assistant at Providence, who carried the food, was to accompany her curé as far as possible on the Lyons road. But the Abbé Tocanier, the curé's assistant, had been told. So had Brother Jerome and Athanasius. So had the mayor. So had the pilgrims and the parishioners. The dismal notes of the tocsin clanged out from the belfry, and when the Abbé Vianney arrived at the footbridge, it was to find his way barred by the crowd. There was no going on, and when the fugitive insisted, the Abbé Tocanier took his breviary from him. That would not stop him, he said. He would go back to his presbytery and get another. The moment he had said that, he had lost the game. Men and women threw themselves at his feet. They begged him not to leave so many souls fatherless. He wept. He went back to the sacristy, resumed his surplice and his stole, and shut himself up once more in his confessional. The Abbé Vianney's great dream of solitude was finished. Whatever he might feel, he was to die as he had lived, a curé. Chapter 16. The Last 20 Years. 2. The closing of the girls' orphanage, the boys' school, missions. Honors came upon the curé. In the midst of his personal trials, a new idea had occurred to the curé. If the bishop wanted to keep him at all costs in the diocese, he could at least arrange to resign the curé of Ars while staying on in the village. His plan was a simple one. Far from stopping the pilgrimage, he would continue to be the inspiration of it and would retain his confessional. But the confessional would be removed just across the way to a chapel which he planned to build on the communal land adjoining the house of Providence at Ars. The saint, it will be recalled, was devoted to this orphanage, which he founded himself in his earliest years in the parish, and where so many poor girls had received a Christian education. His dream then, or one of his dreams, was to take up his retirement in the house of his adopted family. He would live in an adjoining house, and the municipal council would gladly provide the few square yards of land necessary for the building of a chapel. The land was given, and the chapel was built, and on November 5th, 1848, Monsignor Davy, Bishop of Belley, supported by clerical dignitaries and village notables, conducted the solemn ceremony of construction. The day should have been a day of wonderful happiness for the curé, but there was something missing. The congregation was a crowded one, but there was not a sign of his beloved orphans, nor of Catherine, to be seen in the front row, where everyone would have expected her. The life of Ars had lost one of its most cherished institutions. It was a group of strangers to Ars, sisters of St. Joseph of Bourg, serious and recollected, who occupied the front row. They were the new superior and what was now the school and her assistants. For Providence had ceased to be an orphanage. It had become a school reserved for village girls. The bishop had spoken. There had been no choice but to obey. The decision had come as a terrible shock to the Abbé Vianney. He had loved his creation just as it was, with its simplicity and its Spartan comfort. After all, how well the orphans prayed there! There had been complaints, however, suggestions that if the village children were to get proper teaching, they needed mistresses, better qualified educationally and more meticulous in their cleanliness. Finally, There were mothers of families who did not like the idea of their children mixing with orphans who had come from heaven knows where. The complaints found their mark, and the sisters arrived. Out of obedience, the Abbé Vianney submitted without reservation or query to the bishop's orders. There was nothing he could not turn into an occasion of merit. But once the change had come about, he had nowhere to live but his presbytery, and he remained the curé d'ars and continued hearing confessions in his church to the end. But this apparent defeat did not mean that the servant of God ceased to be the man of action and of practical planning. He had always shown himself. He had for a long time been playing with the idea of a free school for boys, which should take in boarders as well, and he wanted to put his important institution in the hands of brothers. It is true that there was already a school run by a native of the parish, Jean Pertinand, the nephew of a priest, but the Abbé Vianney stuck out for his brothers. He found Jean Pertinand a position as manager in the mines at Serrieres in the Isère department, and in March of 1849 3 brothers of the Holy Family of Belley, for whose upkeep the Abbé Vianney had made himself responsible, took over the running of the Ars school. The superior, Brother Athanase, was only 24, and he was to remain in the parish 63 years, teaching in class, singing bass in the choir, or playing the organ, giving music lessons, and acting as master of ceremonies. On top of all that, he was secretary to the Ars municipality, and the Abbé Vianney, whose every word and deed he was to follow for 10 years, always displayed a warm affection for him. In May of 1856, the curé had the satisfaction of blessing the first stone of the future boarding school, but the regard he felt for education was such that he did not confine his activities to his own parish, and he contributed money to the foundation of a number of schools in the diocese of Belley, Lyons, and Valence. Missions were another cause which aroused the enthusiasm of the curé d'ars. He had hardly arrived in his parish than he had a mission preached, and he knew from experience how fruitful such courses of sermons can be. Even if the missionaries feel at the beginning that they are talking in the void, sooner or later a tide of conversions begin to flow, and almost every time soul after soul is brought home to God. How much I regret that I've only thought of this magnificent work so late in my life, the Abbé Vianney confessed in 1850, and he started saving up for it at once. It did not mean that he was less generous to the poor. What it did mean was that he began to ask for offerings for mission work, and that nothing gave him so much pleasure as to watch his little hoard grow. "I'm becoming a miser on God's behalf," he would say with a smile. "I love missions so much." He cried one day in one of his catechism classes that if I could sell my corpse to found one more, I would sell it. One day, in July of 1855, his assistant, the Abbé Tauquenier, relates he came into the dining room of the Ars missionaries at lunchtime. "I've never seen you look so happy, Monseigneur le Curé," said the Abbé Alfred Monheim, his future historian. "I should think I am. I discovered this morning that I had 200,000 francs worth of savings." 200,000 francs? Yes, my dear fellow, and this capital is invested in the soundest bank in the world. I've lent it to the 3 richest people there are. Who are these 3 people? The Abbé Vianney seemed a little surprised that the young missionary had not guessed already, but the Abbé Monheim doubtless wanted to have the pleasure of hearing the secret from the great saint himself. "Well, my dear fellow," the curé resumed after a moment's silence, "they are the 3 persons of the most blessed Trinity." He had, indeed, no idea but their glory in mind, while he had been scraping the huge sum together, penny by penny. As soon as he had enough money to provide for a foundation, he sent it off at once to the bishop's palace, which used it for the benefit of a parish. Thus, though he never left his confessional, his apostleship extended far and wide. He sold everything he could lay his hands on, went into every kind of a trade, as he said jokingly one day to Brother Athanasius. He had, of course, found in his own parish a good number of men and women buyers who were always on the lookout for a good and holy bargain. Long before his death, people had started trying to get hold of things he had used, for no one had any doubt that any souvenir coming from the Curé de Ars would soon be venerated as a relic. He sold the books in his library, his cassocks, his towels, his handkerchiefs, and such of the albs as were his personal property. He sold one for 200 francs to Millet Riquetier, who ended up with a whole museum of souvenirs. Later on, as will be seen, she bought another treasure, which was probably the least commonplace of her whole career. The curé was prudent by character no less than by grace, but he sometimes showed himself of a supernatural imprudence, so complete was his faith in the help of Providence, and he had no hesitation in floating loans in order to make up the sum necessary for the foundation of permanent missions. There was no question of his counting on the Ars parochial income to repay the money, for the flow of pilgrims had not increased it. In 1850, the parish budget showed a deficit of 972 francs, 98 centimes. The next year, this had gone down to 413 francs and 58, while in 1852 there was a surplus of 482 francs, but in 1855, the year of the loans, the surplus stood at no more than 191 francs and 70 centimes. The Abbé Vianney could only count on private charities to pay off this debt. On June 14, 1855, he good-humoredly confided his worries to Brother Athanasius and Jerome, after he had just provided for 3 religious institutions by means of a loan. "If anybody helps me to pay the money back this time," he said, "I'll have to sell my rags, and if they don't fetch enough, I shall find myself in Toulon Gaol." He was no less of an enthusiast for foreign missions, and succeeded in getting every single family in Ars on the subscription list of the Association for Propagation of the Faith. He had known the founder of this organization, Millet Pauline Marie Géricault, while he was a curate at Éclay. Indeed, it was to her that he owed his devotion to Saint Philomena. The total population of Ars was barely 400, yet the little parish had no less than 100 associations, the foreign missionary societies. Though the saint had no time to read, he trenched on his meager hours of sleep to look through the Annuels de la Propagation de la Foi, whose blue-covered numbers, as the crumpled copies he thrust into his library testify eloquently. He often carried about in his pockets. He kept them on him to lend to pilgrims in need of reading matter. The Curé de Ars never gave a thought to honor. He did not lift a finger to solicit them, and they were in no hurry to thrust themselves on him. The civil and religious authorities doubtless thought it would be mere painting the lily to single out for honorific distinctions a character whose loftiness and renown no official sanction could enhance. Monsignor Deve, the Bishop of Belley, who had ordered an inquiry into the Abbé Vianney's conduct after receiving malicious reports on him, had not only dismissed those odious insinuations for what they were worth, he had given all his affection and respect to the man he himself had christened my holy curé. All the same, he had never appointed him an honorary canon of his chapter. At this time there was still a distinction made between curés and simple priests in charge, and it was contrary to practice for a priest in charge to be nominated to a canonry. Monsignor Davy's successor, Monsignor Caledon, did not feel himself bound by custom to the same extent. During the 6 years he passed in the see of Belley, he was only to create 2 honorary canons. Both of them were priests in charge. If outstanding ones, the Abbé Vianney and the Abbé Grignon. On the afternoon of Monday, October 25th, 1852, the Abbé Vianney, who had turned 66 5 months before, was confessing as usual, when he was informed that the new bishop had come to call on him. He lost no time in going out to the entrance of his church to offer holy water to him and to greet him with a few words of respectful welcome. The Curé d'Ars was a master at this sort of improvised eloquence. But he was not given the time for a long speech. He had barely opened his mouth when Monsignor Caledon smittingly pulled out from under his violet mozetta a black mozetta decorated with a band of purple silk and 2 bands of ermine. "No, no, my lord," the saint cried. "Give that to my assistant. He'll look far better in it than I should." The Abbé Raymond, the assistant priest at Ars, was a fine figure of a man, and his superiors said everyone laughing. Monsignor Poncet was there, Desgarret's the mayor of Ars, and a whole crowd of pilgrims who had clustered round the bishop. The Abbé Vianney had to submit whether he wanted to or not. The bishop, the vicar general, and his own assistant priests finally succeeded in putting the cape round the shoulders of the Curé d'Ars. The bishop managed to button the top, and anointing the Vini Creator, entered the church. At his side, his head hanging, paced Canon Vianney, who, as Monsignor des Garnet described, looked like a condemned man being led to the scaffold with a rope round his neck. When the episcopal procession reached the level of the sacristy, the saint, who had never had the occasion to study the ceremonial of the institution of canons, and who anyway was not interested in it, since it was only he who was concerned, ducked through the door to refuge. He obviously wanted to get rid of the new insignia, which was far too distinguished and far too conspicuous for his liking. But the mayor caught up with him just in time to fasten the cape round his shoulders again. "Don't take it off, please," the Count de Graret said. "If you do, you'll hurt his lordship's feelings." Finally, everything went off smoothly. The new canon submitted to listening to the encumens of his bishop, and even wore his cape to accompany him to the presbytery, where there was a reception as cordial as it was homely. Once Monsignor Caledon had gone, the Abbé Vianney could not resist taking a closer look at the beautiful present the bishop had just given him. As soon as he did so, an idea flashed into his head, not of conceit, but of hard cash. "I should wonder if I could make quite a bit of money for my charities with this," he said to himself. Fortunately, there is a witness who can describe exactly what happened. "I had just come back from Villefranche," said Millet Marie Richter, who had a richer stock of recollections than anyone in Ars, "and I went to the curé to tell him about a commission he'd asked me to do for him. 'You've arrived in the nick of time,' he said to me. 'I want to sell you my cape. I've offered it to the curé of Amberou, but he won't even give me 12 francs for it. I'm sure you'll give me at least 15. "'But it's worth more than that.' "'What about 20 then?' Millet Richter was no miser, so she paid the Curé d'Ars 25 francs, but she was also no ordinary purchaser. Her conscience pricked her, and she declared, "I don't think I've given you its real value even now." The cape, which had been made in strict secrecy at Bourg by the novices of the community of St. Joseph, had actually cost 50 francs, and as soon as Millet Richter learned the facts, she paid over another 25 francs to the Abbé Vianney. The curé was so pleased, she said, that he burst out, "Oh, if his lordship would only give me another, I should have some money." However, he insisted that no one but himself should break to the bishop the news of how he had used his present. "Your lordship," he wrote to the palace at Belley 10 days after his installation as a canon, "the cape which you had the great charity to give me has afforded me great pleasure, for since I had not quite got in all the money I needed for an institution, a parish mission, I sold it for 50 francs. I was pleased with this price." If the Abbé Vianney was pleased with the price, the bishop did not show any displeasure either. He even consented to hide his surprise. When the next time he visited Ars, the curé, whom he had made a canon, received him clad in the plain surplice he wore in the confessional. Saints have the gift of getting themselves forgiven anything. It was with the same charming offhandedness that the curé 3 years later greeted his nominations to the Legion of Honor. In concert with Monseigneur Calandon, the sub-prefect of Trevoux, the Marquis de Castellane, and the prefect of the Aisne, the Count de Contlegon submitted a recommendation to the Minister of Public Worship urging the conferment of his honor on the worthy Curé d'Ars. "The Commune of Ars," wrote Castellane, "which was formerly the least known of all those in my arrondissement, is today drawing to it a prodigious crowd of pilgrims. This stream of people, which has been going on for years now, and is due entirely to the reputation for sanctity of a humble country priest, is an amazing fact in a century which has seen the spread of anti-religious teachings hostile to the Christian faith. The people have an unlimited confidence in the priest in charge of Ars. He possesses the evangelical faith which moves mountains. The Abbé Vianney is a second Saint Vincent de Paul, whose charity works wonders. From a purely material point of view, therefore, he is a man of outstanding value to the community. I therefore have the honor, Monsieur le Préfet, to request you to be good enough, on the occasion of the approaching birthday of His Majesty, to propose the nomination of Abbé Vianney, Curé d'Ars, for the rank of Chevalier in the Imperial Order of the Legion of Honor. A decree of August 11, 1855, was the answer to this more than well-earned recommendation, and it only remained to confer the cross on the new Chevalier, Monseigneur Calandon, who was himself an officer of the Imperial Order, would have seemed ideally qualified to do so, but possibly recalling the fate that had befallen the beautiful new cape, he delegated the task to the Abbé Tocnier, the Abbé Vianney's assistant. Supported then by the teaching brothers, the brother sacristan, and the former headmistress of Providence, Catherine, and Jean-Marie Chenet, the Abbé Tocnier presented himself one lunchtime at the new Chevalier's door just as he had gone up to his room. The assistant priest was holding in his hand the box sealed with red sealing wax, which contained the cross of the Legion, and the Abbé Vianney looked at him interrogatively. Perhaps, it's some relic they've sent you," stammered the Abbé Tocnier, who, in his nervousness, had completely forgotten the pretty little speech he had prepared. The curé broke the seal, and saw the gilt and enameled cross. "It's only that?" he exclaimed, as if he were bitterly disappointed. However, as the crown which surmounted the star of the decoration contained the cross, he consented to bless it. But nothing would persuade him to let it be pinned to his chest. He protested that such an honor was too much for him. Then, without a moment's concern or a qualm of conscience, he made the Abbé Taulkneer a present of the coveted insignia. And we will continue this story next Sunday. And thanks for listening to Miss Retro Reads.